Reverend Hilliard, a man whose piety had mellowed into professional apologetics, stood behind the altar in his Lenten stole and made a soft throat-clearing noise that bespoke disappointment without blame. "I believe," he said with the gentle precision of one introducing a schedule change, "that we may have been misinformed as to the timing of Mr. Lynchcombe's final journey." A rustle moved through the nave. Not alarm, certainly not grief. Something closer to administrative interest. "He was confirmed dead, I assume," said Mrs. Verity, whose late husband had once chaired the council's sanitation subcommittee and was still remembered for his firm opposition to plastic bins. "I should hope so," murmured Miss Teatime, a recent transplant to Flaxborough, known chiefly for her ornamental china and a tendency to produce cryptic remarks while arranging delphiniums. Otherwise, it would make the last rites rather premature. She said nothing further, but lifted one eyebrow in a motion so economical as to constitute a budgetary marvel. Mrs. Diggle, youngest of the six and prone to statements made under her breath, glanced about nervously. Perhaps someone ought to ring? Inspector Purbright, who had arrived with no greater expectation than the inevitable thin tea served after the service, was summoned at 11:15 by a church warden, who delivered the request in tones one might reserve for misplaced teaspoons. "Only because it's irregular," the warden said. "Not suspicious, just not usual, if you see what I mean." Purbright did see what he meant. Flaxborough prided itself on order, even in the matter of mortality. Bodies were meant to appear, lie still, and be attended to by respectable people in muted ties. The inspector walked slowly through the vestry, examining nothing in particular. He was a man of unaffected manner, his intelligence appearing chiefly through acts of omission. He disliked forms, but understood their necessity, distrusted statements, yet trusted how people gave them. "Well," he said, stepping into the sacristy, "we can at least eliminate haste from the list of causes." Reverend Hilliard, whose clerical authority rarely extended to confrontation, offered a clipboard and a sorrowful nod. It was all arranged. Simmons's cottage confirmed collection. The grave prepared. The widow's wreath, slightly wilted perhaps, but symbolic. And the coffin? Loaded. Witnessed. Last seen at 10 minutes past 8. Purbright tapped the clipboard with one finger. Left the mortuary? Indeed, driven by young Wobbleby. Comes from a respectable line. Respectable lines, I find, Purbright murmured, sometimes conceal quite vivid junctions. Outside, the widows conferred at the gates, their umbrellas closed but at the ready. Mrs. Flitch stood imperially still, as though she might absorb sunlight purely through disapproval. "It's an embarrassment to the town," she declared, though not, I suppose, a surprise. Mrs. Troke gave a little cough, the kind used to preface nothing. Purbright paused near the lich gate, pretending to study the church notice board. A scrap of newsprint had blown against the frame. Funeral times revised for budget cuts. Council votes 5-3. Inside the vestry, the coroner's assistant, a thin man named Chubb, with a voice like a snuffed candle, had completed his telephone rounds. He entered without ceremony and offered a single line that would, if not rearrange priorities, at least tilt them gently. "There was a coffin, sir," Chubb said, looking faintly embarrassed by the statement's lack of poetry. "Just not a body. From 6 widows and the missing corpse, Inspector Purbright. Mysteries." Mrs. Alma Flitch lived at number 7 Tethering Lane, a semi-detached villa of considerable rectitude, distinguished chiefly by an ornamental goose on the lawn and a front door painted the color of boiled rhubarb. The goose, which was cemented to its plinth with the same moral firmness that Mrs. Flitch brought to her volunteer work, wore a seasonal ribbon, presently mauve, in deference to Lent. Inspector Purbright arrived at 3 minutes, precisely as arranged, though he might have arrived unannounced, without provoking more than a faint upward flick of one imperious eyelid. Widow Flitch's welcome was neither warm nor cold, but precise. She opened the door at once, with the certainty of someone who had already observed his approach through a curtain. "You're punctual," she said, as if this were both expected and mildly inconvenient. "Come in. I have put the electric fire on, though you may find the room a little overfamiliar." The sitting room was upholstered in chintz and restraint. On one side, a sideboard housed an unbroken run of porcelain birds. On the other, a low table bore the weight of an immaculately typed agenda for the Ladies' Bereavement Circle, clipped at the corner with a bulldog fastener of military bearing. Purbright accepted a seat, but declined sponge fingers. "They crumble," he offered apologetically. "I tend to drop crumbs into my paperwork." Mrs. Flitch made no comment. She poured tea with slow deliberation, then folded her hands in her lap with the precise air of a woman awaiting judgment, though not expecting to be found wanting. "You knew Mr. Lynchcombe well?" "I knew of Mr. Lynchcombe," she corrected, "as does anyone in this town who has had the misfortune to require his professional attentions. He was adequate." "Adequate," Purbright repeated, nodding gently. "Not warm, then?" "Warmth," said Mrs. Flitch, "has its place, but not in oak caskets, Inspector." He smiled faintly. Was he a friend of the bereavement circle? She regarded him with something like polite amusement. He was an applicant. An applicant? Oh, yes. He took to appearing at meetings, claimed that grief was not gendered. I don't dispute the sentiment, but one feels the tone of the circle would have adjusted. Adjusted how? There would have been less knitting and considerably more discussion of cushions. Purbright sipped his tea. Did he disrupt the meetings? Not overtly, but he did dominate the biscuit selection. She rose and retrieved a slim folded newsletter from the escritoire. The ink was pale, the font selected more for decorum than legibility. At the margin of the February entry, a faint pencil notation read, "HL, not to be encouraged." "Whose hand?" Purbright asked. "I cannot say. The circle's minutes are distributed in type only. That is how one avoids creative embellishment." "But you circulated this?" "Of course. We are not clandestine, Inspector. Merely selective." He tucked the leaflet away. "You didn't find his presence alarming?" Mrs. Flitch frowned, not at the question but the wording. "If you mean, was he improper? No. But he was always too ready with a hand on a shoulder, and he lingered at the tea urn. One began to feel observed. By a widower. By a widower," she repeated, with unmistakable distaste, "who showed no real signs of mourning." There was a pause. In it, the electric fire clicked softly, as though embarrassed to be noticed. "Had he expressed intentions toward any of your members?" Mrs. Flitch lifted her cup with both hands. "He was not, I believe, a stranger to sentiment, but his expressions were indirect. He sent Mrs. Verity a bulb catalogue through the post, unrequested. Suggestive, not of tulips." They sat for a moment in mutually agreeable silence. Then Purbright stood, brushing a non-existent crumb from his trousers. "One more question, Mrs. Flitch. Do you know a name, Weatherby?" She hesitated, a fractional narrowing of the eyes. I did once, years ago. A curate, I think. Not from this parish. He vanished, quietly. Any relation to Harold? If so, it was not advertised. But Mr. Lynchcombe had a fondness for borrowed names. His dog was called Stanley, though its real name was Victor. Apparently, Stanley sounded less working class. Purbright thanked her and stepped out into the cool afternoon, where the ornamental goose glared outward with civic suspicion. As he reached the gate, she called after him. You might ask Miss Teatime. She remembers everything, except birthdays. Miss Teatime. She keeps the flower rota, Mrs. Flitch said, and paused. And one suspects several confidences. As the gate clicked behind him, Purbright made a mental note. Not about flowers, nor rotas, but about the peculiar phenomenon of women who mourned decorously, resisted questions graciously, and nevertheless knew everything before the newspapers did. From 6 widows and the missing corpse, Inspector Purbright, mysteries, the ladies' bereavement circle, though nominally open to new members, operated in much the same manner as an exclusive pension fund, cautiously, procedurally, and only in cases of proven loss. Its minutes, composed on a second-hand Olivetti and duplicated by carbon sheet, were kept in a folder secured with a pink ribbon of such faded hue that it might once have been red. Inspector Purbright sat alone in the police station's interview room, the file open before him, a faint scent of lavender rising from the paper, as though morning had its own approved fragrance. The minutes were spare. Devotions were noted, refreshments listed, and motions recorded with the respectful sterility of a lawn bowls club. Yet February's entry, dated 2 weeks prior to the vanishing, was curiously worded. Item 6. Certain discomfort has arisen following the repeated presence of Mr. H. Lynchcombe at monthly meetings. Though his losses are acknowledged, it is agreed that the circle's purpose is not inclusive of male companionship. There was a gentle firmness in the phrasing, like an apology made in stone. Beneath the official wording, a parenthetical had been added in darker ink. Mrs. Diggle, emotional. Mrs. Verity, firm. Purbright turned the page. March's minutes were blank. At 10:30, he left the station and crossed to the high street, where Miss Teatime could usually be found on Tuesdays, tending the war memorial flower beds with a pair of secateurs and an air of mild resignation. Today, however, she was seated in the library's reading room, trimming clippings for the Circle's scrapbook with all the delicate concentration of a medieval illuminator. Inspector, she said, not looking up. I trust the church still stands. It does, he replied, though it's presently one body short of capacity. She permitted herself a small smile. One should never rely too much on undertakers. Their work is largely one way. He settled opposite her. Did Mr. Lynchcombe make a habit of appearing where he wasn't expected? She selected a clipping with daffodils. Not a habit, more of a strategy. He would arrive late, wait for tea, and inquire after everyone's health in a tone not unlike a solicitor with a prepared will. Was he intrusive? Only in the way that static can be. Persistent, uninvited, and hard to ignore. She placed the clippings in an envelope marked Spring Themes and gave him a measured glance. You must understand, Inspector. He had the manner of a man conducting business. Even his condolences felt itemized. Did anyone object formally? Mrs. Verity tried to propose a membership charter. Mrs. Diggle wept quietly and claimed Harold had only ever spoken to her about begonias. Were there relationships? Not in the romantic sense, Miss Teatime said. though Harold did have a way of making loneliness sound like a joint investment. Purbright took from his coat a hotel receipt bearing the name H. Weatherby. Does this name mean anything to you? She examined it briefly. Ah, the ghost returns. Elaborate? There was once a curate here, Ethel Weatherby, left under what the vicar described as delicate circumstances. It was 1958. Her name has not been spoken since, except by people who remember quietly. Do you suppose Harold knew her? If he did not say. But he did use the name. I received a postcard last year from Whitstable, signed H.W. It contained no message, only a photograph of a rock garden. A man with no family often tries on other names for size. He stood. And what size did Weatherby appear to be? Miss Teatime resumed her clipping. One that fitted, I think, but only just. As he walked back to the station, the inspector reflected on men who drifted toward widows, who borrowed names like coats, and who, when they vanished, left behind precisely the sort of silence that people agreed not to disturb. When he reached his desk, a note awaited him from the desk sergeant. Phone call, Mrs. Stroke. Said to tell you she had something Harold left behind. Said it may be of no importance, but she's changed her mind about throwing it out. The note was unsigned. Purbright tucked it into his notebook, made no expression at all, and poured a fresh cup of tea. From 6 widows and the missing corpse. Inspector Purbright. Mysteries. The term glove drawer in Miss Teatime's bungalow did not refer to a mere receptacle for hosiery. It was, in fact, a low cabinet of Edwardian origin, mahogany naturally, kept beneath the sitting-room window and opened only on Tuesdays after bridge or in the event of exceptional gossip. That Inspector Purbright should be admitted to it on a Thursday was not merely unusual, but vaguely ceremonial. You'll forgive the intrusion, he said, though he had not knocked so much as tapped lightly on her garden gate, which opened at once. Miss Teatime, in a lilac housecoat and brooch shaped like a butterfly undergoing tax reform, smiled with the decorum of a woman accustomed to both secrets and silver polish. I have nothing to hide, Inspector, she said, ushering him inside. But I do occasionally like to remember where I put it. The room smelled faintly of beeswax, lavender, and the sort of potpourri that gives off the impression of being too dignified to decay. Sugar? She asked, gesturing to the tea tray. I've just had some, Purbright said, which was almost true. I haven't, she said, adding 2 spoonfuls to her own cup with gentle defiance. But I find sweetness improves accuracy. Now, how may I be moderately helpful? He produced a photograph. Harold Lynchcomb, seated at a seaside cafe table, wearing a smile that might have been casual if it weren't so self-conscious. Taken in Whitstable, he said. Sent under the name H. Weatherby. You mentioned a postcard. She nodded. Yes. The handwriting was polished, possibly rehearsed. It said nothing but arrived 2 days after the Circle's Christmas luncheon. I believe he was trying to tell me something. And what would that be? That he had plans, but not confidants. A not uncommon condition among men of a certain age. She rose, crossed to the glove drawer, and opened it with a small brass key worn on a chain. From within, she withdrew a thin sheaf of correspondence, neatly tied with green ribbon, the sort used in parcels from minor shops with aspirations. These came last year, all unsigned, all hand-delivered, no stamps, most are nonsense, but one, she said, withdrawing a cream envelope with faint foxing, is more articulate than the rest. Purbright read silently. The note was brief. You always arrange the lilies without forcing them. That's what I remember. Do you suppose forgiveness can be grown from bulbs? He returned it to the envelope. Do you believe Harold wrote this? Miss Teatime inclined her head. If he did, he was more literate than he let on. But the envelope was left with the church bulletin. No fingerprints, and too careful for accident. Do you think it's connected to the will? She sipped her tea, winced slightly, and reached for a lemon wafer. Ah, yes, the will. Or should I say, the wills? I've reason to believe Harold amended his bequests on more than one occasion, and not always in ink. Which of the widows benefited? I believe Mrs. Diggle was named in the first, Mrs. Verity in the second, and Mrs. Troke in the most recent. If Mrs. Flitch was omitted, it was not due to oversight. Harold disliked being corrected on matters of punctuation. You seem remarkably well informed, Purbright remarked. I play bridge with Mrs. Troke. One sees things, and one is occasionally dealt a hand of astonishing indiscretion. The inspector rose and made a small, formal bow. You've been very discreet. I try to be, she said, though it's increasingly out of fashion. As he stepped onto the path, she called after him. Inspector, would you care to know what gloves I didn't find? He turned slowly. There was a pair. Grey kid, men's, size medium, slightly worn. I used them for polishing brass. They've disappeared. From here? She nodded. And recently. I only noticed when I went to buff the lid on the communion cruet. Anyone else in the house? Only the cat, and he's more likely to shred than to steal. Purbright smiled faintly and tipped his hat. We'll add glove theft to the list of sins then. Somewhere between impersonation and floral misappropriation. As he walked back through the narrow lanes of Flaxborough, the inspector reviewed what he had gathered. A man with multiple aliases, letters unsigned but revealing, and a missing pair of gloves in a drawer rarely opened. He stopped briefly beneath the war memorial and stared at the inscription, Peace to the innocent and the unknown. Two groups Harold never quite joined, he murmured. From 6 widows and the missing corpse, Inspector Purbright. Mysteries. In Flaxborough's municipal cemetery, burial plots were laid out with the sort of military symmetry that suggested not so much repose as quiet discipline. Row E, Section 3, where Harold Lynchcombe's final residence had been reserved, enjoyed modest afternoon sun, a direct view of the tool shed, and the lingering scent of weed killer. It was, as graves went, perfectly adequate. Unfortunately, it was also perfectly unoccupied. The exhumation, prompted not by suspicion, but by an unseemly conundrum of logistics, was carried out under a polite veil of municipal embarrassment. Reverend Hilliard, in attendance but not officiating, muttered a brief, reversible prayer. Purbright, standing at the edge of the disturbed turf, merely folded his hands behind his back and stared as the coffin lid was levered off by 2 councilmen with the air of reluctant archaeologists. Inside was no corpse. Instead, 2 sacks of builder's lime and an unopened tin of bird's custard powder. That, said Constable Love, blinking slowly, is not in the standard funeral package. Purbright inclined his head. Unless Flaxborough has begun catering for the afterlife. The lime, according to Mr. Chubb, the coroner's assistant, was common enough. A material used historically for discouraging decomposition and uncomfortable questions. But its presence, alongside the custard, struck an oddly domestic note, as though someone had staged a symbolic burial, intending to satisfy the eye but not the conscience. Is it possible, asked Hilliard, gently fidgeting with his cassock sleeve, that this is All symbolic. Purbright said nothing. His gaze rested not on the coffin, but the disturbed earth beside it, where a sliver of striped string, the sort used for brown paper parcels, lay half-covered in loam. I don't believe symbolism usually involves so much twine, he murmured. That afternoon, back at the station, Purbright requested the mortuary records. The town mortuary, which doubled as a maintenance storeroom and part-time records cupboard, offered little comfort. The logbook had been kept in a blue binder marked Shovels, Various. Inside, the final entry for Mr. Harold Lynchcomb was brief. 10th March. Body prepared for delivery. Collection arranged. Wobble by. 8 மணி 10 நிமிடம். No signature. No confirmation of arrival at the cemetery. And no indication of who had actually seen the body last. Mr. Wobbleby himself was currently visiting his cousin in Eastbourne. A semi-annual ritual accompanied by letters, home describing sandwiches in coastal cafes and the subtle decline of national manners. Purbright returned to his desk, laid out the various scraps of evidence like a gentleman preparing for a modest card game, and considered his position. No body, no clear timeline, no motive. But a growing consensus among the 6 widows that Harold Lynchcomb's absence was, if anything, more agreeable than his presence. At 4 o'clock, Miss Teatime arrived unannounced. I brought a clipping, she said, from last year's Whitstable Gazette, page 6, a report of a disappearance. He read it twice. A guest at the St. Mildred's Rest Hotel, one Mr. H. Weatherby, had reportedly left without paying, though the manager's tone was more hurt than indignant. He left the towels folded, she had said, and a note. Forgive me. I needed to disappear more than I needed to settle up. Purbright closed the clipping and looked up. Whitstable again. Miss Teatime nodded. He was always fond of small hotels. They give the illusion of intimacy without the burden of familiarity. Do you think he staged the burial? Harold. Numberine thinks someone else did, at his suggestion. Harold rarely lifted anything heavier than a sympathy card. Purbright considered this. So either he faked his own death, or someone faked it for him. Or both, she said, rising, which would be very Harold. He believed in partnerships, particularly the silent kind. As she left, the sun dipped behind the council offices and cast a long shadow across the station steps. A junior constable emerged with the post, a single envelope, addressed in looping hand to Inspector Purbright. No return address. Inside, a photograph. 6 widows seated at a luncheon table, each in black, hats discreet, expressions variously indulgent or unreadable. At the far right, Harold Lynchcomb, mid-toast, raising a glass of sherry, smiling faintly. Alive. On the back, in pencil, the ones who stayed. H.W. from 6 widows and the missing corpse. Inspector Purbright. Mysteries. Mrs. Ivy Diggle lived in a modest red brick bungalow on the edge of town, where the shrubbery was kept short enough to discourage speculation, but not so bare as to invite pity. The curtains were drawn at precise angles, and the milk bottles, too, stood rinsed and upright beside the bin, as if waiting for a verdict. When Inspector Purbright arrived, she answered the door with a sort of grateful confusion, as though she had feared the call might never come. Oh, Inspector. How formal, she said, smoothing her cardigan with both hands. I didn't think I'd be needed. Purbright inclined his head. You said you found something. She blinked. Oh, yes. Yes, it's just something he left behind. They entered the parlor, where a gas fire clicked, and a faint scent of boiled beetroot lingered. On the sideboard stood 3 ceramic kittens, and beside them, a sealed envelope addressed in block capitals, to be destroyed, unread. "I didn't," Mrs. Diggle confessed, eyes downcast. "I thought I would, but then I thought, what if it was important? What if it was meant for someone? Not me, obviously." He never said anything clearly. Purbright took the envelope gently. "And when did you find this?" "Tuesday," she said. "Behind the sideboard. I was dusting. Well, rearranging. Harold was particular. He liked his sideboards at a strict 45 degrees. Did you know him well?" "Oh, not in that sense," she said quickly, before he could clarify what that sense might be. "He came round for tea, sometimes. Always with those little mints, the ones that taste like the inside of a handbag." "Did he speak of his affairs?" "He spoke of his digestion. And once he said I had a restful presence. I thought that was kind." Purbright opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of hotel stationery. Saint, Mildred's Rest, Whitstable. The message read, "I won't be there. Forgive me. You were the only one who ever asked me nothing. Please don't ask now." Below, a small initial. H. Mrs. Diggle reached for a tissue. "I never asked, because I didn't want to know. Not really. He was always so quiet when not speaking. I think that's what people don't understand. Silence can be very companionable." "Did he promise anything to you?" She gave a weak smile. "Only that I'd never be the one blamed. He said that, very directly. You'll come through clean, Ivy." I thought it was a compliment. Purbright stood. "Do you know who he was afraid would blame you?" "I don't think Harold feared people," she said after a pause. "He feared being forgotten. He'd rather be missing than missed." As Purbright made for the door, he noticed a photograph above the gas fire. It showed a younger man in a stiff collar, seated on a deck chair. He looked familiar. Not in detail, but in outline. "That your husband?" "Yes, Bernard Diggle. Died in 62. A civil servant. Rarely civil." Purbright stared a moment longer. The man's profile was astonishingly close to one he had seen before, in the belongings recovered from Lynchcombe's cottage. "Ivy," he asked, turning back, "did Harold ever say he'd known Bernard?" She frowned. "Number though, once he said I had married wisely. I thought he meant I hadn't remarried." Back at the station, Purbright retrieved the photograph from Lynchcombe's drawer. The resemblance to Bernard Diggle was too close for coincidence. Same parted hair, same narrow mouth, same air of personal retreat. He set the photos side by side and sat quietly for a while, allowing no conclusions, but granting several possibilities, the comfort of proximity. At dusk, he returned to his desk to find a file from the Whitstable police waiting. Inside, 3 reports, all unsigned. A clerk had annotated one in pencil, guest registered as H. Weatherby. No official ID, paid in cash, left no forwarding address, spoke often of Flaxborough. On a hotel invoice was a note in the margin, written in unfamiliar hand. "The past is safest when gently misremembered. From 6 widows and the missing corpse. Inspector Purbright. Mysteries." At 6:30 on a Thursday, the Mothers' Guild convened in the vestry of St. Etheldreda's, as it had done since the war, the second, though in style still rather shaped by the first. The smell was chiefly furniture polish and faded carnations, and the talk, when not of sponge recipes or the vicar's dietary peculiarities, turned, with genteel inevitability, to Mr. Lynchcombe. "Well," said Mrs. Stillingfleet, who wore 2 brooches to signal enhanced authority. I always said Harold was a man of ceremony, just not, apparently, of substance. There was a ripple of pained chuckles. Even among the devout, the unexplained absence of a corpse at one's own funeral was considered, at best, in poor taste. Miss Teatime, seated near the trolley of weak tea and unfair biscuits, said nothing. She sipped and watched. Guild Secretary Mrs. Bransby was reading aloud the minutes from the previous meeting, a detail-by-detail account of trestle table arrangements for the Whitsun fete, when Miss Teatime leaned slightly forward. "I wonder," she said, in a tone as smooth as syllabub, "if the guild kept records of widows' bequests. I only ask because Harold once mentioned his legacy to the ladies of the lilies, which I presumed was poetic, but perhaps not entirely." Mrs. Bransby blinked. "We don't encourage that sort of thing. Not officially. It would be compromising, morally or administratively." "Both," said Mrs. Stillingfleet briskly. "And we mustn't speculate, particularly about money." Which, in Flaxborough, meant precisely the opposite. Later that evening, in her own kitchen, Miss Teatime opened her notebook. Her list read: Mrs. Diggle, emotionally discreet, possibly manipulated. Mrs. Coombs, known to have hosted Harold for bridge, though she never owned cards. Mrs. Threadgold briefly ran a grief support group Harold attended exactly once. Mrs. Pettigrew received a taxidermied parrot from Harold's estate, sentimental reasons. Mrs. Lellam held insurance. Harold once sold. Mrs. Bransby, treasurer of the guild, oversaw Harold's donation in 1979. She tapped the pen twice. Only one, Mrs. Threadgold, had no known ongoing connection to Harold beyond a single meeting. Odd, in a town where funerals came with follow-up. The next morning, Inspector Purbright visited the registry office. It was housed in an annex that smelled of old envelopes and recent disenchantment. The clerk, Miss Sims, was young, alert, and discreet in the bureaucratic way. Eager to help, unwilling to appear eager. "Mrs. Eunice Threadgold," Purbright said mildly. "I believe she's registered as a widow?" "Yes. Since 1987. Husband was a Mr. Morris Threadgold. Died of..." "Yes, a fall while pruning." "Indeed. Was there ever a second marriage?" Sims scanned her ledgers. "Number but." Her brow furrowed. "There's something unusual." Before she became Mrs. Threadgold, she was registered under another name, Ivy Diggle. Purbright paused. "Not Ivy May Diggle?" "No," said Sims. "Ivy Marguerite. The first marriage was dissolved. Not common at the time." "Do you have the date?" 1951, to a Bernard Diggle. No death certificate, just a decree nisi, no forwarding details." Purbright thanked her and returned to the station, thoughtful. 2 Ivies. 1 man, 1 surname. 2 women listed as widows. And one of them, presumably, knew nothing. Back at his office, he found Constable Love standing awkwardly with a parcel. "This came by hand, sir. No name, just left at the desk." Inside the box was a bundle of pressed flowers, mostly lilies, bound with string. Beneath it, a folded square of paper bearing one line. 3 of them knew. 3 of them guessed. But none asked. From 6 widows and the missing corpse. Inspector Purbright. Mysteries. The Flaxborough crematorium stood in a gully behind the old cattle auction site, tastefully veiled by hedging and euphemism. It was not a building one stumbled upon, nor one that welcomed the idle curious. Indeed, the administration office bore the words, "Strictly by appointment," in lettering so forbidding it had already buried several inquiries. Inspector Purbright arrived at 10 minutes past 11, which was late enough to imply apology, but early enough not to require one. He was met by Mr. Ellesmere, the crematorium's chief registrar, a man of such arid dignity that one felt the very concept of death might feel itself rebuked. "We don't lose bodies," Ellesmere said flatly before Purbright had spoken. "Not in the literal sense." "Then I must commend your metaphysics," said Purbright pleasantly. "But you understand the cause of my visit." Ellesmere sighed through his nose. "Lynchcombe's service was scheduled, but never processed. The coffin arrived, yes, but we were told by the funeral home to delay. Temporary hold, they said, for procedural reasons. Unspecified. Do you recall who gave that instruction?" Ellesmere opened a thick logbook. "A Mr. Woodruff, assistant to Lynchcombe himself. Young man, nervous disposition, frequently overperfumed." "Was the coffin opened?" "Certainly not," said Ellesmere, affronted. "We're a facility, not a theatre." Purbright nodded. "And yet you keep records of contents." "Sealed assurance forms, yes. We rely on the undertaker's statement that the casket holds the named remains. We're not, as it were, a rummaging service." Purbright asked to see the form. It bore Woodruff's signature, attesting that Harold Lynchcombe's body had been enclosed, sealed, and delivered. "Would you describe Mr. Woodruff as reliable?" "Reliable in the way of a frightened typist. Willing, but only under instruction." Purbright thanked him and made his way out into the sun, which lay on the car park like a judgment. As he walked, he considered the peculiar loyalty of assistants. How often fear could masquerade as honesty and obedience as grief. Back at the station, Constable Love had compiled what he called a widow's trail, which was mostly a tangle of overlapping tea visits and charitable subscriptions. But one detail stood out. "Mrs. Lellam," he said, "runs the local insurance trust. She made a payout last April, small policy, nominal, but it went to a name I hadn't seen before. Weatherby." Purbright looked up. "That's the alias Lynchcombe used in Whitstable." Love beamed with mild triumph. "Exactly. She listed it as clerical error when I asked, but wouldn't say more." Purbright made a note. "Then we shall call on Mrs. Lellam and inquire whether her paperwork is always so poetic." They found her at home that afternoon, tending to a rhubarb cloche with the delicate hostility of someone denying a rumor. "Insurance is often misinterpreted," she said, once inside. "It's not a fortune, more a kindness paid backward." "Yet in this case," said Purbright, "the recipient never died." "I corrected the form," she said sharply. "There was confusion. The name was on a legacy file, a technicality." "Mr. Weatherby," said Purbright. "Was he a client?" She hesitated. "He was a suggestion." "From whom?" "From Harold," she said quietly. "He asked that I enter the name provisionally, then revise it once the estate settled. He said it was for the good of the parish." "And you believed him?" Mrs. Lellam looked out the window. "Belief is sometimes the only way to stay welcome." On the way back, Love ventured a thought. "You think he made himself disappear?" "I think he orchestrated a disappearance," Purbright replied. "But whether he's vanished or merely delayed remains the open question." That evening, Miss Teatime attended evensong, as was her habit when the air turned too thick with speculation. The sermon was on Lazarus, a man both dead and inconveniently alive. She smiled faintly at that. As she turned to leave, a small hand tugged her sleeve. It was one of the altar boys, red-cheeked and urgent. "Miss," he whispered, "I saw a man. Looked like Mr. Lynchcombe. walking past the vestry yesterday, but he didn't look dead, miss." He winked. Miss Teatime gave a single nod, then bent down as though adjusting her glove. "Well," she murmured, "some men do their finest work after death." From 6 Widows and the Missing Corpse. Inspector Purbright. Mysteries. In Flaxborough, theft was generally considered a failure of upbringing rather than of law. A missing purse might prompt polite sympathy. The disappearance of the Mother's Guild minute book, however, provoked something perilously close to indignation. Mrs. Stillingfleet discovered the loss on a damp Tuesday morning while preparing for the Guild's quarterly audit of tea towel expenditures. The cupboard where the book was kept, beneath the vestry sink and behind the tin for hymn sheet donations, was conspicuously bare. "There's been tampering," she declared to Reverend Hilliard, who responded with the circumspection of a man who once mislaid the key to the communion wine and never quite recovered his authority. "I'm sure it will surface," he said. "Things usually do, when one ceases to look." Mrs. Stillingfleet, who never ceased to look for anything, reported the incident to the police within the hour. At the station, Constable Love wrote "Mother's Guild records, missing," in careful capitals, underlining it once with exaggerated seriousness. Purbright, when told, merely raised an eyebrow. "It's an unusual theft," Love offered. "No market value, just minutes and attendance." Purbright leaned back. "And yet, it may be the most incriminating object in Flaxborough, assuming, of course, someone took minutes on more than milk quantities and hymn rotations." Miss Teatime, when told of the incident, displayed neither alarm nor surprise. "Well," she said, "I dare say the book was more observant than its authors. Some women write minutes as if expecting future prosecution." Indeed, several members of the Guild had used the book as a kind of domestic codex, discreetly noting who had hosted whom, which sponge had fallen flat, and, more crucially, who had been present when Mr. Lynchcombe attended the Guild in his short-lived role as associate sponsor. The term had raised few questions at the time, largely due to the port he had supplied. Purbright called on Mrs. Coombs that afternoon. She greeted him in an apron printed with marching teacups and wore an expression suggestive of polite dread. "The minute book, Inspector? Oh, I haven't touched it. I'm barely in the minutes myself, really. One forgets to vote or speak." "Did you attend the Guild's July meeting last year?" She hesitated. "I think so. Harold spoke,